Welcome to this presentation. I will present today some results of recent activities on estimating yield responses to climate variability and extreme events. I will mainly refer to two papers that have recently been published on this topic. The motivation of this work goes very much back to the observation of climate change and increasing climate variability and extreme events that we have experienced ourselves in the recent years. If you think of the extreme drought years in 2018 and 2019, but also 2022, and some of the plots that we have seen with respect to temperature anomalies here shown for Germany by the German Weather Service, but we see similar plots also for other countries and globally. The impacts of climate change we also experience, as I already referred to 2018, severe droughts with substantial impacts on cereal production in Germany, less than 20% of what we've normally achieve at country level, but also in other years before and later we have experienced severe droughts. So that has motivated us to understand the effect of climate change on crops better, and particularly to understand our ability to estimate yield failures in order to be able to better support adaptation planning and risk management. So the research questions of this work were pretty much related to are there distinct spatial patterns in yield failure among years and crops, and which factors are responsible to explain these failures? I have included here a graph that shows spatial patterns of yield failures for one crop maize of 2 years, and I've included here as well results of a drought monitor that shows the severity of drought or extreme drought here by the very dark color in the 2 years, and you can already see that the drought patterns are not the same, whereas the yield patterns seem quite similar in those 2 years. Another question is, can we quantify yield failure, the spatial and the temporal yield variability particularly, and if not, which relationships and processes are missing in our models in order to be able to improve our ability to quantify these failures? The approach considers data of 4 crops in Germany between 1998 and 2018 that we had available with a relatively high spatial resolution of NUTS 3 regions. And we tested yield estimations using process-based crops models. We used here the Simplex model that captures most of the important variables when it comes to climate change, temperature, rainfall, radiation, to name the most important ones. But we also used data-driven models, classic statistical approaches, and machine learning approaches, support vector machines here, and random forest models. Some results of these studies are summarized here. First, we look at the spatial variability of yield failures across different crops. And we look here into 1 year, 2013, and we can already visually see quite nicely that the yield failure, the pattern of the yield failure is different depending on the crop. So we compare maize as compared to rapeseed in this year, the patterns look quite differently. If we then also consider the different years, and here we look at the 5 most severe, most extreme years of the 20-year period we analyzed, then we see that across these extreme years, the patterns are also different, so that we have differences between the crops and across the years. And the question now is, to which extent can we understand the factors that determine these responses? We looked into the ability of different models. I already described that. And what we see here is a measure of the ability of the model to simulate yield variability for the area that we considered of Germany with respect to the support vector machines. And the darker blue, the color is the higher is the correlation coefficient between estimated and observed yield, process-based simulation models, and individual variables of which we thought they are good predictors of yield failure, for instance, drought or heat or season length. We see that support vector machine and process-based models do the best job. Not so much heat, that was some surprise to us, but drought for some crops also seems to be a pretty good estimator of yield variability. We've then tried to understand better to which extent these approaches are able to discriminate between years where we have extreme yield failure and years where we do not have that. So it's kind of a measure of the prediction accuracy of yield failure of these approaches. And we see that support vector machine again do a very good job in the accuracy of predicting yield failure years, which is sort of resembled by the steepness of the curve and the area underneath the curve, which sort of are measures of the accuracy of the predictions. But we also see the process-based models do a fairly good job for most of the crops, or for all 4 crops considered, in terms of being able to identify the extreme years with where we see a high yield failure. We spent some more time to also understand to which extent different machine learning approaches give similar or different results. We compared support vector machines with random forest models, and also try to understand how many predictors do we need in order to do a good job in resembling observed yield variability and extreme yield failures. And we find that in general, those 2 models that we compared are pretty similar, although different predictors work for different models. And in general, about 12 predictors are apparently sufficient in order to do a fairly good job in estimating yield variability, and the accuracy is about 50 to 70% of what we've observed. Although the predictors can change, providing the same results. And I've come to the conclusion, some of the conclusions from these studies. We find that years associated with widespread yield failures across crops were generally associated with severe droughts. But for years with more localized yield failures and large differences in spatial patterns of yield failure among crops, no single driver or combination of drivers was identified. That makes it more complicated in order to estimate yield failures in those years. So there are relatively large residuals of unexplained variation, likely indicate the importance of non-weather related factors such as management, factors related to pest, weeds and nutrient management that have some interaction with weather and which are not well enough yet considered in our modeling approaches. We think that the potentially the combination of process-based crop models and data-driven models are very promising in order to also capture those factors well enough in our approaches. But it needs some improvement of our machine learning approaches. We have already a fair good results with respect to using those models, data-driven models, in terms of simulating or estimating spatial temporal variability of the 4 crops considered, between 50 and 70%. But we also learned that we will need expert judgment in order to be able to set up those models properly in order to consider the predictors that make sense and that should be considered in these models. Thank you very much.